Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we drift quietly into a world drawn not with satellites or screens, but with ink, patience, and prayer. Before explorers set sail, before compasses found their north, the shape of the world was kept alive by monks in silent monasteries where daylight came through narrow windows and every breath of dust seemed ancient. They drew the earth as they imagined it to be. Oceans were circles of faith, mountains were strokes of devotion, and at the center of every map was heaven. Tonight, we'll travel slowly through the candlelit world of the medieval cartographers. The men who believed that by drawing the earth, they could come a little closer to understanding creation itself. So, settle in. Let your mind quiet like an old library, and as the ink begins to flow, let's begin our story, the silent maps of monks. Imagine, if you will, the quiet before dawn, in a place that no longer quite exists. An Ashanti marketplace, somewhere in what is now southern Ghana, perhaps near Kumasi. The air is soft, slightly cool, and smells faintly of earth and roasted plantain from the night before. The first traders have already begun to stir. You can almost hear the swish of woven cloth, the rustle of raffia mats being unrolled, and the small coughs of women clearing their throats as they prepare for another long day. This was not a market of chaos. It was a living system, one that moved with slow rhythm and patience. Long before coins or printed notes found their way here, trade was measured not with numbers on paper, but with tiny brass weights, small sculpted objects known as each with its own careful balance and its own quiet story. The Ashanti were meticulous people when it came to trade. Gold was their lifeblood, the pulse that connected the forests of West Africa to the distant edges of the world's wealth. Yet, gold dust, the form in which it was usually traded, was far too fine, too subtle, to be trusted to human eyes alone. So, these traders, goldsmiths, and market women developed a precise system of measurement that relied on small metal figurines, each calibrated to a known weight. A single weight might be shaped like a turtle, another like a human stool, another a simple geometric form, a cube or a pyramid. They were beautiful, though no one in the market would have called them art. They were tools first, their beauty an accidental byproduct of necessity. But like so much in human history, the mundane object outlasted the moment of its use and became the key to understanding a civilization. You can imagine the sound of the day beginning, the rhythmic beating of pestles, the crackle of palm leaves, and somewhere the faint metallic ring of brass weights being set upon small wooden scales. The women, for it was often women who managed the trading tables, would take small scoops of gold dust from tiny leather pouches, weighing it out on the scales before them. They worked calmly, almost ceremonially, for fairness was everything. A wrong measure could spark an argument, or worse, a lasting mistrust. The markets of Ashanti were intricate networks of trust and routine. They were not mere places to buy and sell, but spaces of social order, diplomacy, and quiet storytelling. The traders might discuss the quality of the kola nuts, or the arrival of salt caravans from the north, or perhaps the gossip of the royal court. Each story, each rumor, wove its way into the market's hum, as much a part of the daily trade as the weights themselves. Picture those gold weights, perhaps a small lizard cast in brass, or a fish, or even a miniature stool resting quietly in the dust beside a scale. Each one had been carefully made by a craftsman somewhere in the region, cast using the lost wax technique, a process as ancient as the art of metal itself. The artisan would shape a tiny model from beeswax, coat it in clay, then heat it until the wax melted away, leaving an empty mold. Molten brass was then poured in, and when it cooled, the clay would be broken open to reveal the finished weight. No two were ever quite the same. It was a time-consuming process for something so small. But for the Ashanti, precision was sacred. Trade depended on it. So, a merchant might spend hours comparing one weight to another, ensuring that each piece was true to its measure. Over time, the weights developed into a kind of language, a quiet code of symbols and memory that could be read by those who knew how. There were weights shaped like crocodiles, symbolizing cunning and adaptability. Birds, symbolizing freedom or migration. Stools, symbolizing leadership. And geometric patterns that hinted at balance and order. The imagery spoke softly but persistently, whispering lessons, proverbs, and reminders about how to live and trade with fairness. The Ashanti, like many West African cultures, valued proverbs deeply. They believed that wisdom, when hidden in metaphor, lasted longer. So, it is perhaps not surprising that their system of trade weights also became a system of quiet communication. Each weight carried more than just mass, it carried meaning. By midday, the market would be alive. Cloth merchants would unroll bolts of indigo-dyed fabric. Ironmongers displayed hand-forged blades, their edges catching the sun. The smell of smoked fish mixed with palm oil and red earth. And in the midst of all this, the gold dust continued to change hands, measured and remeasured with patient care. Gold, to the Ashanti, was more than wealth. It was the physical embodiment of sunlight, purity, and the divine. It was said that the first king of the Ashanti, Ase Tutu, had received the golden stool from the heavens, a sacred symbol of unity and kingship. Every grain of gold dust in the market was, in some distant way, a reflection of that same heavenly gift. The gold weights thus took on an almost moral dimension. They reminded people that trade was not only an exchange of goods, but a reflection of justice and community. To cheat in the market was not just to steal, it was to disrupt the balance of the world. Still, for all their beauty and meaning, the gold weights were practical things. They were kept in small wooden boxes, alongside tiny scoops, brushes, and bits of cloth used to clean gold dust from the crevices of scales. A trader might own dozens of them, each marked and remembered. Children might inherit their parents' set, carrying forward both a business and a lineage. And while these objects were small, their world was vast. Through networks of trade that stretched across forests, rivers, and deserts, Ashanti gold reached as far as North Africa and even Europe. When Portuguese traders first arrived on the coast in the 15th century, they marveled at how organized, how precise the inland trade systems already were. The Portuguese brought muskets, glass beads, and textiles, but it was gold that they sought. And so, the humble brass weights of the Ashanti quietly shaped the flow of global wealth. You can almost imagine one of those early European visitors standing at the edge of a bustling market, bewildered by the measured calm of it all. The traders were not rushing, not arguing. There was rhythm, predictability, an order born of long trust. They would have seen the gold dust gleaming faintly in the light, and perhaps thought wrongly that this was primitive commerce. They did not yet understand that each grain of gold had been weighed, debated, and sanctified through centuries of quiet practice. If you were to visit a museum today, perhaps in London or Washington, you might find a small glass case filled with these weights. They look unassuming at first glance. Little brass figures no larger than a coin, their surfaces dulled by time. But when you lean closer, when you imagine the lives that touched them, the scales they once balanced, the markets that once buzzed around them, they begin to hum softly with the weight of memory. There are estimated to be over 3 million Ashanti gold weights still in existence across collections worldwide. Each one, however small, is a record, not of kings or battles, but of everyday fairness. They are the quiet arithmetic of trust that kept a society moving. As the market day ends, traders begin to pack their goods. The light shifts to amber, and the dust in the air glows like suspended gold. Somewhere, a child plays with a discarded brass weight, tracing its shape with curious fingers. She doesn't yet understand its meaning or how it connects her to generations past. But the story is already being passed on. It's easy, from our modern distance, to forget how much of civilization depended not on grand inventions or royal decrees, but on the small, repetitive acts of measuring and weighing, of fairness and patience. The Ashanti gold weights, like the market itself, were humble mechanisms that held the world in balance. But what if those little sculptures, turtles, fish, men, birds, were not merely decorative symbols of trade? What if they also held an entire moral code, a quiet philosophy of life and justice embedded in their forms? What if, hidden in the most boring tools of the market, the Ashanti had left behind a secret language, one that spoke not just of gold, but of wisdom? When you look closely at an Ashanti gold weight, Wheelie Crosman, the way a craftsman or trader once did under the dim light of dawn, you begin to see that they are not random designs. They are not merely decorative, nor accidental. Each curve, each figure, each pattern carries meaning, layers of memory, proverb, and quiet philosophy pressed into metal. To understand them is to glimpse how a society once thought about the world, not in abstract categories, but through objects that people could hold in their hands. In Ashanti culture, the proverb was the heart of wisdom. Proverbs were used in speech, in dispute, in marriage negotiations, even in the subtle diplomacy of the marketplace. They were the connective tissue of conversation, moral compasses disguised as riddles. A wise speaker might quote one in passing, letting it hover in the air, forcing the listener to reflect rather than react. And the gold weights were, in many ways, proverbs made solid. Take, for instance, the weight shaped like 2 crocodiles joined at the belly, sharing one stomach, but each with its own head. The image refers to the proverb, the 2 crocodiles share one stomach, yet they fight over food. It was a warning against greed and division, a reminder that within a family, or a community, or even a kingdom, selfishness destroys harmony. Traders who used such a weight would see it daily, each time they measured out gold dust, as a quiet moral lesson, a kind of visual conscience resting on the scales. Another weight might take the form of a man and a woman seated side by side, their hands extended toward one another. It recalls a proverb about cooperation, that men and women must work together for prosperity, neither dominating the other. In the market, where women were the primary traders, and men often the metal workers, this was a lived truth. Then there were geometric weights, simple cubes, triangles, pyramids, or stepped designs. At first glance, these appear purely practical, made for precision. But even these forms had symbolic undertones. A pyramid shape might echo the idea of stability, a structure that broadens its foundation to reach upward, much like a kingdom supported by its people. The repetition of balanced angles reminded users that trade itself depended on symmetry and fairness. The Ashanti did not separate art from utility, or the sacred from the mundane. A stool could be both furniture and throne. A comb could carry a message of beauty and dignity, and a gold weight could weigh a few grains of gold while quietly conveying an entire philosophy of justice. Each weight's meaning often depended on oral interpretation. There were no written explanations. The objects spoke through shared cultural understanding. A child growing up in the Ashanti kingdom would learn, slowly, what these symbols meant, from stories told by parents, traders, or elders in the shade of a mango tree. In this way, the market became both a place of commerce and a quiet school of ethics. Now imagine a craftsman at work, perhaps in a small village not far from Kumasi, around the early 18th century. He sits cross-legged on the ground, a small fire burning beside him, his tools scattered around in deliberate disorder. Before him lies a piece of soft beeswax. With his thumb and forefinger, he shapes it gently, building the figure of a bird with outstretched wings. He is not working quickly. He hums a tune as he shapes the wax, smoothing its form until it feels right. When it's done, he lays it aside to dry, then covers it in fine clay. Later, he will heat it, let the wax melt away, and pour in molten brass, watching the orange glow fill the mold. When it cools, he will break the clay to reveal the small bird, now transformed into metal. This single act, the casting of a gold weight, is both labor and meditation. The craftsman knows that someone will use this little bird to weigh gold, yes, but he also knows it will outlive him. It might pass through dozens of hands, across markets and generations. He may never know who will hold it, but he knows that when they do, they'll remember the proverb tied to the bird. A bird will always return to the tree it loves. In Ashanti thought, this was a proverb about loyalty and belonging, a reminder to remain connected to one's roots, even as trade and wealth carried people far from home. As the centuries passed, thousands upon thousands of such symbols were made. The variety was staggering. There were weights shaped like fish, reminding traders that the fish that loves water is never afraid of the rain. There were snakes, frogs, drums, stools, swords, and human figures in poses that echoed everyday life. Each symbol was both literal and poetic, a reflection of how the Ashanti viewed the interconnectedness of all things. Trade was not only economic exchange, it was moral and social continuity. The marketplace, therefore, became a kind of living library. Each trader's collection of weights told a personal story, of family, of travel, of values held dear. In some cases, weights were even given as gifts, symbolic tokens of friendship or respect. To receive a weight was to receive a message encoded in bronze. This blending of moral teaching and material precision made the Ashanti gold weight system unique in the world. While other cultures also used small weights for trade, from the Islamic dinar systems of North Africa to the Indian gold merchants of Gujarat, none turned the tool itself into such a richly symbolic language, and yet, for all its meaning, the gold weight system was never grandiose. It remained intentionally ordinary. There was no central authority dictating which symbols were allowed, no royal standardization beyond basic units of mass. The kingdom maintained a kind of ordered flexibility, allowing creativity and regional expression to coexist with strict economic fairness. This balance between regulation and artistry is one of the quiet wonders of the system. The moral codes embedded in the weights extended beyond the marketplace. Ashanti society was structured around ideas of balance between individuals, families, and the greater whole. Their traditional laws, known as abushua, emphasized responsibility to one's lineage and respect for harmony. The same hand that carefully weighed gold dust might later pour libation for ancestors or sit in council to resolve disputes. For the Ashanti, measurement was not only physical, it was ethical. To measure gold fairly was to maintain cosmic order. The scales in the market were mirrors of justice itself. One can imagine how it felt for a trader, after a long day, to pack up her goods and her box of brass weights. She would brush the dust from each one, wrap them in cloth, and store them carefully. Perhaps she whispered a small prayer, not to grow rich, but to remain honest. The next morning she would begin again, repeating the same motions, the same care, day after day, season after season. In that repetition lies the essence of history's quiet endurance, the small, faithful gestures that keep a civilization in rhythm. As centuries passed, the system evolved. Contact with Europeans brought new goods, new currencies, and new pressures. Yet, even as coins and paper money began to circulate, many traders continued to trust their scales and weights. To them, these little objects were more than instruments. They were anchors in a changing world. Even today, among Ashanti descendants, the symbolism of the weights remains part of cultural memory. Some are worn as jewelry. Others are displayed in homes as reminders of ancestral wisdom. A crocodile weight might sit on a shelf, silent yet eloquent, still whispering the same lesson about unity and greed that it did 3 centuries ago. What is perhaps most beautiful about this system is how boring it is, at least at first glance. There are no grand battles here, no sudden discoveries, no royal decrees, just the slow, steady rhythm of trade, of people weighing gold, talking, teaching, remembering. But through that quiet repetition, a moral and artistic tradition flourished, one that outlasted kingdoms, and it leaves us with a question that lingers gently in the air. If these small brass figures carried stories, lessons, and warnings for those who traded with them, what stories do our own everyday objects carry now? The coins, cards, and screens we use without thought. What values do they weigh silently as we move through our modern markets? The market has long since gone quiet. The dust has settled, the scales are packed away, and the air smells faintly of the fires that have burned low through the evening. In the darkness, one can almost imagine the small gold weights, those tiny figures of brass and bronze resting in their boxes, dreaming of the countless hands that once touched them. They are silent now, but they were never meaningless. The story of the Ashanti gold weights. In a sense, the story of how memory endures, not through noise or monument, but through quiet repetition. When the Ashanti kingdom rose to prominence in the 17th and 18th centuries, its rulers and merchants built a society sustained by balance. Power rested not only in the king's golden stool or in the royal regalia of gold, but in the careful, invisible trust that moved between ordinary people. Trade bound them together, and trust was measured in brass. Over time, the small sculptures of the marketplace began to do something remarkable. They started to transcend their practical function. As they passed from trader to trader, family to family, the meanings attached to them deepened. A weight was no longer just a unit of measure. It became an heirloom, a link to the past, a conversation across generations. When a mother passed her set of gold weights to her daughter, she wasn't only transferring tools of trade, she was passing down a code of fairness and wisdom. And when a young craftsman learned to cast weights from his father, he was learning not just technique, but restraint, patience, and respect for the balance of things. It's easy to imagine the scene. Two figures, one older, one younger, seated near the glow of a furnace. The elder points out how the wax should curve, how the mold must be dried slowly, how too much heat will warp the metal. There is no hurry. There is only the quiet discipline of learning to make something just right. The student might not yet grasp the full meaning that he is participating in a system older than the kingdom itself, but in time, he will. For every weight, whether shaped like a bird or a stool, carries more than mass. It carries continuity. Even when empires shifted and European traders arrived with coins stamped with distant faces, the Ashanti continued to use their weights for local exchange. For them, value was not something declared by foreign kings or printed on paper. It was something agreed upon, tested, and confirmed over scales and dust, among people who knew one another by face and by name. By the 19th century, however, the world was changing. The rise of colonial rule brought new economies, and with them, a slow fading of the old market practices. Coins replaced gold dust. Scales gave way to fixed prices, and the small brass weights, once handled daily, began to slip quietly from use. Some were melted down for metal. Others were stored away in chests, forgotten for decades. Still others were sold or taken, sometimes traded with Europeans who admired their craftsmanship, not realizing the complex cultural web each object represented. Museums in London, Paris, and Berlin began to fill with these weights. Thousands of them, lined up in glass cases, catalogued and labeled as Akan gold weights or Ashanti currency instruments. To the curators, they were ethnographic artifacts, evidence of a curious, methodical people who had developed a remarkable economic system. But in those quiet rooms, behind glass and dim lighting, something else happened. The gold weights removed from their markets, stripped of their proverbs, their stories, their dust became something entirely new, echoes. You can stand before them today and feel that silence. The little crocodiles and birds and human figures are still there, but their meaning hovers just beyond reach. Without the voices that once explained their proverbs, they seem almost mysterious. Yet their quiet presence has a power of its own, because even without the sound of the market, they still speak of measure, of patience, of fairness, of time. When Ghana gained independence in 1957, the legacy of Ashanti craftsmanship remained alive in many ways. Artisans continued to cast metal using the lost wax method. The motifs of the gold weights, the crocodiles, the stools, the birds, reappeared in textiles, carvings, jewelry, and modern art. They had become cultural symbols, representing not only the Ashanti but Ghana itself, a nation built on the careful balance of tradition and change. In Kumasi, the cultural heart of the Ashanti region, artists still reproduce the gold weights. Some make them for sale to tourists, others for ritual use. A few attempt to recreate the precise measurements and forms of the old system, treating each reproduction as both art and preservation. To hold one is to feel the faint warmth of history in your palm, a small, solid reminder of the past's persistence. The symbolism remains deeply woven into Ashanti identity. The proverb of the two crocodiles, for example, continues to be cited in Ghanaian politics and education as a metaphor for unity, for the idea that a divided people cannot prosper when they share one fate. The bird returning to its tree speaks still of loyalty to one's homeland, echoing through speeches, songs, and family teachings. And yet, the most profound legacy of the gold weights may not be symbolic at all. It may simply be the attitude they represent, the slow, deliberate attention to balance in all things. To weigh gold fairly was an act of respect. To craft a weight perfectly was an act of devotion. These were not grand gestures, not history book moments, but quiet habits that built trust in a world where nothing was written down. The Ashanti gold weights remind us that civilization depends not on spectacle, but on subtle, repetitive acts of integrity, on the kind of patience that weighs carefully before it decides. The modern world moves much faster. Markets now exist in pixels, and our measures of value are hidden in algorithms and numbers we can't quite see. Fairness feels less tangible. And yet, the lesson of the Ashanti market, that value must be balanced, not just counted, still hums faintly beneath the surface of things. Perhaps that's what gives the gold weights their lasting calm. They remind us that behind every transaction, every trade, there is a human story, one of trust, labor, and care. The scales must balance, yes, but so too must the heart. When you picture them again, those tiny figures resting in the dust, gleaming softly in the filtered light of the market, it's easy to feel a certain peace. Their work was simple, their purpose clear, and yet they carried within them the essence of something eternal, the desire for fairness, the patience of craftsmanship, and the quiet dignity of people who believed that even the smallest acts could hold meaning in the end. The gold weights did not vanish. They changed shape, becoming symbols, museum pieces, lessons. Their proverbs still move, their patterns still inspire. The world they once balanced has shifted, but the echo of their measure remains, and maybe, in some small way, that's what history really is. Not the loudness of kings and wars, but the faint, enduring hum of people who measured the world carefully, one grain of gold at a time. So, as you let this story settle, You might imagine one of those traders at dusk, her scales packed, her goods sold, her box of weights beside her. She looks out over the quiet market, the air cooling, the dust turning gold in the last light of day. She breathes in, satisfied. The day was fair. The measure was true, and tomorrow she will weigh again. You wake in the dark. It's cold, and the air smells faintly of damp stone. Somewhere above, a faint chime echoes through the cloisters, soft, rhythmic, and utterly precise. A monk stirs, then another. The first bell of matins has sounded. It is time to rise, to pray, to begin again. This is not the world of modern hours and minutes. This is Europe in the 9th or 10th century, when time did not yet belong to everyone. It belonged to the monasteries, before the ticking of clocks, before wristwatches or town towers. It was the monks who kept time for the world. Their days were carved not by sunlight or shadow, but by prayer. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, divided each day into 8 sacred offices: matins, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Each one required its own bell, its own careful rhythm. But there was a problem. The sun could not be trusted. Clouds hid it. Seasons shifted. Winter days were short, summer days long. If prayers were to be perfectly timed, the monks needed a more constant measure. And so, in the quiet of their abbeys, they began one of the most methodical, most boring, and most influential experiments in history: the invention of reliable timekeeping. Imagine the abbey courtyard just before dawn. A single monk, perhaps the sacristan, walks slowly with a small lantern, checking the clepsydra, a water clock that stands in the corner of the cloister. It's a simple device, a large jar with a tiny hole at the bottom, dripping water at a steady pace into another jar below. Lines carved on the inside mark the passage of time as the water level drops. It is quiet work. He watches the flow, adjusts it slightly with a reed, and listens to the faint trickle echoing off the stone. The sound of dripping water, that is the sound of time in the Middle Ages. Every so often, he notes the level, and when the right moment comes, he rings the bell, not too early, not too late. The sound ripples through the sleeping abbey, bouncing off the walls, stirring those who must rise for prayer. This daily routine might seem tedious, even dull, but it was one of the earliest forms of scientific precision practiced in medieval Europe. The monks, in their search for spiritual discipline, became accidental engineers. They needed regularity, and so they created it. Their schedules were strict, not for punishment, but for devotion. Each hour of prayer had to be balanced, measured, and predictable. Too much sleep, and one risked sloth. Too little, and the body failed. The abbey's rhythm, its breathing, depended on exact timing. The clepsydra, however, was imperfect. The rate of water flow changed with temperature and with the wear of the hole. So the monks experimented. They added floats, pulleys, and weighted arms that could ring bells automatically when the water reached a certain level. In doing so, they were not only keeping prayer, they were inventing the idea of mechanical time. There's something peaceful in imagining how this happened. One monk hunched over a table of tools, another testing a bell mechanism, both working silently under candlelight. They were not aiming to change the world. They simply wanted the bells to ring on time. Yet, in the process, They laid the foundations for every clock that would follow monastic timekeeping, shaped the rhythm of medieval life beyond the cloister walls. Farmers in nearby villages listened for the abbey bells to know when to start their work, when to rest, when to end the day. In many towns, the abbey's chimes were the only public measure of time. In those days was a sound before it was a number. If you had stood on a hillside at dawn, you might have heard it, a faint peal from one direction, then another. The distant ringing of different abbeys. The bells didn't match perfectly. They were human, after all, but they formed a kind of slow, overlapping music. Time passed, not in ticks, but in tones. For the monks, however, this order was sacred. Time belonged to God. Each ringing of the bell was a reminder that the day, like life itself, was structured for prayer and purpose, and so they measured it, not for profit, not for schedules, but for the soul. As centuries passed, some monasteries grew remarkably advanced in their systems. The great Abbey of Cluny in France developed a reputation for near-perfect discipline. Its bells were so precisely timed that travelers would adjust their own routines by them. Monks at Cluny kept multiple water clocks, maintained through the night, and recorded astronomical observations to ensure seasonal accuracy. Their lives revolved around measurement, not of wealth, not of land, but of hours. Yet the discipline had side effects. The mechanical mind that grew within these walls, the habit of counting, regulating, and testing, began to seep into the broader world. The same patience that guided prayer now guided invention. The same devotion that measured hours would soon measure stars, gears, and machines. But in these early centuries, all was still slow, deliberate, quiet. The monks did not yet imagine cities of factory bells or watches that ticked endlessly. For now, they watched water fall through stone jars, and time flowed like the trickle of a stream, as the sacristan adjusts his clepsydra one final time and listens to the last few drops. You can almost sense the stillness of the abbey rows of cloaked figures kneeling, chanting, breathing in unison. The rhythm is absolute. The world beyond the walls may be uncertain, kings rise, wars burn, seasons shift, but here, time is steady, measurable, and mercifully predictable. And yet, a question begins to form. As small and quiet as that falling drop of water, if time can be measured so carefully, if every hour can be marked by human hands, does it still belong to heaven? Or are the monks, in their quiet precision, slowly taking control of something once thought divine? If you could walk through a medieval monastery in the 13th century, you would find a world half lit by candlelight and half filled with invention. It might surprise you. These were places of silence, of prayer, of routine, and yet within their walls, some of the most important machines in human history were being born. The monks were not engineers by trade. They were timekeepers of devotion, caretakers of rhythm. But their need for accuracy, for consistency in their prayers, slowly transformed them into something new, the world's first mechanical thinkers. For centuries, they had relied on water to mark the hours, patient, imprecise, beautiful. But water was fickle. It froze in winter, evaporated in heat, and slowed or quickened with temperature. Bells rang late or early. A minute of error became a crack in the harmony of divine order. And so the monks began to dream of a device that would not depend on nature's moods, a machine that could hold time by itself. That dream first took shape in Northern Europe sometime around the late 1200s. The earliest mechanical clocks did not have faces or hands. They did not show the hour, they sounded it. Imagine an enormous contraption of iron weights, gears, and ropes built into the wooden beams of a monastery tower. When the heavy weights descended, they turned a series of wheels that, through clever engineering, caused a hammer to strike a bell. Each hour was marked not by numbers, but by sound. No one knows exactly where the first of these clocks stood, perhaps in St. Albans Abbey in England, or Dunstable Priory, or perhaps in a monastery in France or Italy. But one thing is certain, the idea was monastic. The monks, seeking constancy for prayer, created something that would outlast them all, a machine that measured not just hours, but human intention. Inside these early clockworks, time became mechanical for the first time. The flow of water was replaced by the fall of weight, a mass of stone or metal suspended by a rope, slowly unwinding. Gears transmitted the motion from one wheel to another. And at the heart of it all was the most ingenious invention of the medieval mind, the escapement. It was a simple, beautiful device, a small piece of metal that escaped one tooth of a gear at a time, locking and releasing it rhythmically. The escapement made the tick-tock possible. It divided time into equal portions, gave motion a heartbeat, and turned what was once the sound of water into the sound of machinery. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It's strange to think that one of the most enduring sounds of modern life, the ticking of a clock, was first born in the echoing stone halls of monasteries. Early clocks were enormous, loud, and clumsy by modern standards. They had no minute hands, no precision beyond the hour. But to the monks, they were miraculous. A bell could now ring at the exact same moment every day without human intervention. Prayer could flow as smoothly as gears. The bell tower became a symbol of divine order, time made visible, audible, and disciplined. But beyond devotion, something deeper was changing in the human relationship to time itself. Before the clock, time was organic. It followed the seasons, the sun, the rhythm of labor and rest. People worked until dark, slept when tired, and measured their days by the natural world. But within monastery walls, time had been made abstract, divided into equal segments, detached from nature. Each hour was identical, whether it fell under summer's light or winter's shadow. It was the beginning of a transformation that would, centuries later, shape the industrial world. Still, within the abbeys, it was a sacred transformation. The clock was not yet a tool of commerce. It was a servant of faith. Each chime of the bell was a prayer in metal. Each turning gear, a reminder of divine precision. Some monks saw the machine as a metaphor for creation itself, God as the master clockmaker, the universe his intricate device. The idea spread quietly through theology and philosophy, the world as a mechanism, designed, ordered, predictable. The clock had not only measured time, it had redefined how people thought about it. Consider again the great Abbey of Cluny, where the days began and ended with bells. By the 14th century, such monasteries possessed clocks so advanced that visitors traveled from afar just to hear them. The machines inspired awe, iron skeletons moving with purpose, gears whispering, bells singing through fog. at night. When the bells rang for the early prayers of matin, their echo carried through the sleeping countryside, marking not just the hours of monks, but the rhythm of whole villages. The sound of mechanical time had entered human life. It is difficult to imagine how profound this was. For the first time, a machine, something man-made, was controlling the daily behavior of hundreds of people. The line between divine order and human invention had begun to blur. One could stand in the abbey courtyard, look up at the tower, and feel the strange comfort of predictability. Time no longer flowed, it ticked. And though the monks would never have admitted it, their creation had become a quiet form of power. There's a certain poetry in that. The very tool designed to humble men before God, to make their hours obedient to prayer, would one day become the tool by which factories governed workers, schools ruled children, and trains kept nations synchronized. But that was still far in the future. For now, in these centuries of faith and stone, the ticking of the monastery clock was not tyranny, it was tranquility. Its sound mingled with the chanting of psalms, the creak of wooden doors, the hiss of candles burning low, a heartbeat of devotion, measured, mechanical, eternal. The monks had done something extraordinary in their quiet persistence. They had made time visible, countable, and endless. Outside, in the villages below, life still followed the old rhythm of the sun. But slowly, imperceptibly, the bell towers began to teach the people a new rhythm, a rhythm not of seasons, but of hours. And once humanity learned to hear time, it would never again be able to stop listening. When the first mechanical clocks began to tick in monasteries, they were instruments of devotion. But, as often happens in history, what began as a sacred rhythm soon spread beyond its walls. The sound of time escaped the abbey, and once it did, it could never be contained again. By the 14th century, the sight of clock towers had begun to appear above towns and cities. First, in places like Milan, Strasbourg, Wells, and Padua, later across France, England, and the Low Countries. These were civic versions of the monastic idea. Public clocks meant not just to regulate prayer, but commerce. It's easy to picture the moment, a craftsman pausing in the market square to listen as the great bell rang out from a newly built tower. The townspeople, who once followed the rhythms of daylight and Bella's church calls, now heard something new, a measured, mechanical authority. The clock told them when to open their shops, when to meet at council, when to close the day's trade. Time, which had always been a companion, now became a master. And in a quiet, almost invisible way, the monastery had taught the world to obey the machine. The earliest town clocks were magnificent. Their dials were painted in gold and blue, their faces adorned with zodiac signs and saints. The clock of Rouen shone like the firmament. The astronomical clock at Strasbourg, built in the 14th century, showed not only the hours, but the movement of planets and the phases of the moon. These were not mere instruments, they were symbols of civic pride, proof that human craftsmanship could mirror the cosmos. But beneath the splendor, something subtle was changing in human consciousness. The monks had used clocks to regulate prayer. The townsmen used them to regulate labor. In the marketplace, time became currency. An hour could now be measured, divided, sold. The merchant began to think in hours worked and profits earned. The craftsman began to feel the pressure of the bell. The idea of efficiency, though centuries away from its modern form, was already taking root. The rhythm of the monastery order, precision, repetition was quietly shaping the rhythm of the world. As the mechanical clock spread, so too did the sense that time was not infinite. It was something you could lose, waste, or save. The Latin word tempus, once sacred, began to mingle with the language of money. The phrase "time is precious" took on a new, literal meaning in this way. The monastery's discipline seeded both modern science and capitalism, two worlds born from the same devotion to measurement. Yet, within the monasteries, there was an unease. Some elders wondered if the clock, once a tool of worship, had begun to lead men away from contemplation. Where once bells had called them to prayer, they now called others to work, to trade, to ambition. In a letter written in the late 1300s, an unnamed abbot in Burgundy complained that the clock divides the day too finely, and we forget the purpose for which it rings. It's a haunting line, a reminder that even the simplest invention can carry unintended power. But power, once invented, is seldom undone. In the centuries that followed, clockmakers refined their craft. The verge escapement was replaced by the pendulum, a revolution that made clocks accurate to seconds rather than minutes. With accuracy came new possibilities: astronomy, navigation, exploration. Timekeeping no longer served prayer or commerce alone. It became the foundation of discovery. When sailors crossed oceans, they carried clocks, chronometers, that let them measure longitude. When scientists studied the heavens, they timed eclipses and planetary motion. And when factory owners in the 18th century began to organize labor, they did so to the ticking of clock hands. All of it, all the precision of modern life, could trace its ancestry back to the slow drip of water in a medieval cloister, to a monk marking the hours for prayer. It's a strange thought that the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the modern workday, even the 9-to-5 schedule, were born not in the noise of machines, but in silence, in discipline, in faith. There is something deeply human about this transformation, the way a tool made for devotion becomes a tool for progress, then control. The clock became a mirror of us, our patience, our ambition, our anxiety about how much time we have left, and yet there is beauty in it too. The clock gave us not only structure but wonder, the ability to measure the invisible, to see the rhythm of the universe in gears and weights. By the 17th century, when thinkers like Descartes and Newton described the world as a great mechanism, they were echoing the monk's earliest philosophy. The clockwork universe, the idea that nature itself runs like a machine, became the foundation of modern science. Every atom, every orbit, every second, moving according to precise laws. It began, perhaps, with a simple question in a monastery workshop: how can we keep the hours more faithfully? Faith, in the end, created science. Prayer built the first machines. The devotion to divine order became the devotion to mechanical order. And when we look today at the glowing numbers of our digital clocks, at watches that tick invisibly with quartz or light, we are still heirs to that same impulse to measure, to organize, to understand. You might imagine, then, standing again in the courtyard of a medieval abbey, the clock bell tolling above you. The monks move through the cloister, their sandals whispering on the stone. The rhythm of their lives feels eternal, yet what they have built will outlive them all. Outside, across centuries, the rhythm spreads into workshops, into ships, into cities, into your own room. The same rhythm, steady, mechanical, patient, tick-tock, tick-tock. A sound that once called men to prayer now marks the seconds of your day. Perhaps that is the quiet legacy of those monks, that they taught us not only how to pray on time, but how to live by time, and yet, somewhere in that steady sound, if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint echo of devotion, not the tyranny of hours, but the peace of rhythm, the quiet reassurance that time moves, gently and endlessly, whether we keep pace or not. The gears sigh, and the monastery returns to silence. The day, once again, has been measured and released. If you had wandered through a medieval English fairground around the 12th or 13th century, you might have noticed something curious: entire buildings that seemed to appear overnight. Rows of timber-framed stalls, roofs of thatch or canvas, painted signs, even small rooms where merchants lived and slept. And then, just as quickly, the structures vanished again, leaving only flattened grass behind. It might sound like a simple detail of medieval commerce, and in truth, it was, but hidden within these fleeting constructions lay the seed of an extraordinary idea: the portable house today. We think of mobile homes as a modern invention: trailers, prefabricated units, minimalist architecture on wheels. But the concept is far older. Long before industrial tools, long before factory precision, medieval builders were already perfecting the art of modular living, homes designed not to stand forever, but to move when needed. To understand how and why this began, we have to travel back to a Europe that was still rural, fragmented, and restless. Life in the Middle Ages was not as static as we sometimes imagine. Peasants might stay tied to land, but craftsmen, merchants, and builders, they moved. They followed opportunity: a new bridge to construct, a cathedral foundation to help raise, and for those who lived by their trade, shelter could not always be permanent. In England, Germany, and parts of France, guild builders began to create timber frames that could be disassembled, transported, and reassembled elsewhere. The secret was in the joinery, the careful carving of wood so that beams could lock together using pegs and mortise holes. Without the need for nails, a carpenter could build a frame in one place, mark each piece with a chisel symbol, a triangle, a cross, a chevron, then take it apart and reassemble it perfectly somewhere else. Each piece of wood carried a story, a mark of its role in the greater whole. In some surviving medieval frames, you can still find those marks today, faint but deliberate, a quiet reminder that this house was once on the move. We think of medieval life as slow, but this system made building astonishingly efficient. A modest home or shop could be set up in days, not months. The same team of builders might move from town to town, raising entire streets of timber frames as though assembling great wooden puzzles. These portable buildings were not only practical, they reflected a way of life that was seasonal and fluid. A merchant's house might be taken down after a fair season ended, stored through the winter, and raised again the following spring. Traveling performers and peddlers used simpler versions, collapsible booths or wagons fitted with fold-out walls, the ancestors of modern food stalls and caravans. And yet, What's truly fascinating is how this idea, born from necessity, slowly began to shape the very concept of architecture. Up until this period, a building was seen as a thing rooted in place, like a tree. A church, a manor, a mill, each belonged to the ground it stood on. But a portable house introduced a radical thought that a building could belong to its inhabitants, not the land. It's a small philosophical shift, but it had enormous consequences. In a world where ownership and feudal power were tied to immovable property, a structure that could move disrupted that order quietly. A portable home was not part of a lord's estate. It was part of a person's life. In many towns, local authorities began to notice. Tax rolls sometimes distinguished between permanent dwellings and movable booths. The latter paid less, or sometimes nothing at all, since they left no lasting mark on the ground. It was, in a sense, the medieval version of a tax loophole, and it made mobility not just a convenience, but an advantage. There's a record from 1321 of the Stourbridge Fair near Cambridge, one of the largest in Europe, describing booths of timber well made and jointed, which after the fair are taken apart and stored. Another account from the German Rhineland in the late 1200s mentions Wanderbelut, literally wandering builders, who traveled with frames and tools, ready to construct lodgings and shops wherever trade flourished. Over time, this technique evolved. Builders began to standardize the size of beams and joints so that pieces could be reused between different structures. The earliest example of prefabrication, what we now call modular construction, was, in essence, already known to them, though no one at the time would have given it a name. Even great lords began to see the value. When noble families moved between estates, their household pavilions, rich with fabric and carved timber, were built to be dismantled and carried in wagons. Royal courts, too, embraced mobility. The English kings of the 13th century, who ruled from itinerant palaces, lived in what were effectively portable households. Their kitchens, chapels, and even sleeping chambers could be packed up and rebuilt wherever the court stopped. The traveling court of Edward I, for instance, moved across England and Wales with hundreds of wagons, carrying not only tents and furnishings, but prefabricated wooden structures that could be assembled into halls and offices. The medieval monarch did not simply visit towns. He rebuilt his world at every stop. In the smaller scale of fairs and towns, ordinary builders mirrored that practice in humbler form. They built with flexibility in mind, walls that could be taken apart, beams light enough for 2 men to lift, joints that could survive multiple assemblies. In these details lay the birth of an architectural idea that would echo across centuries, that home could be temporary, adaptable, and even personal. Of course, these portable homes were never meant to last forever. Their timbers aged quickly, the joints loosened after many uses, the roofs wore thin with travel. But perhaps that impermanence was the point. In a world where everything from weather to politics could change without warning, it was wiser to build for movement than for eternity. In this way, the medieval portable house was not just a clever design, it was a philosophy of survival. To move was to endure. To rebuild was to continue, and as Europe slowly grew more connected through trade routes, pilgrimages, and wars, the ability to carry one's world became a quiet form of power. But, of course, there's more to this story. Because from these humble beginnings, the timber frames of fair booths and royal halls would arise an entirely new profession, and eventually a new way of imagining architecture itself. For soon, someone would realize that if a house could move once, then perhaps a city could move too. By the 14th century, the idea of the portable home had grown far beyond the bustling market fair. What began as a clever solution for merchants and wandering builders had caught the attention of Europe's most powerful rulers. For if a merchant could take his shop wherever trade called, why couldn't a king take his court wherever power demanded? To understand this, you must picture medieval kingship not as we do now, not fixed in grand palaces, but constantly on the move. A medieval monarch was not just a ruler of land. He was the center of a living, moving household. The court, hundreds of people, animals, cooks, priests, guards, clerks, traveled endlessly because authority had to be seen to be real. A king who stayed still too long risked losing his influence. So, the great households of Europe became rolling kingdoms, living cities that appeared and vanished across the countryside. And at the heart of these traveling worlds were buildings that could move. When the English King Edward I rode through his dominions in the late 1200s, his household brought with it what contemporary records call movable chambers of timber. These were prefabricated structures, wooden halls, sleeping rooms, chapels, and kitchens built in panels that could be packed onto wagons. Each beam and board was marked with numbers and notches so it could be reassembled in the right order. It was not a small operation. Edward's court required hundreds of wagons, thousands of animals, and a small army of carpenters. Chroniclers describe whole villages transformed into royal camps overnight, halls rising like stage sets, tents glowing with torchlight, the smell of roasting meat drifting across fields. Within a day, a barren meadow could become a palace. Within a week, it could vanish again. The French kings did much the same. During the 100 Years' War, when royal safety required mobility, even the great halls of state were designed to travel. They were not houses in the modern sense, but movable architecture, a kind of early logistics. Centuries before the word existed, it is easy to imagine the strange beauty of such a sight. Carpenters hammering beams together under open skies, tapestries hung between portable walls, the king's dais assembled board by board. Everything temporary, yet arranged with ceremony and care, as if even impermanence could be made majestic. And perhaps it could. For to move one's palace was not just a necessity. It was a declaration. It said that power was not bound to place. Wherever the king slept became the center of the realm. Other groups took this idea further still. Military campaigns of the Middle Ages relied heavily on mobile architecture, not only tents, but entire field, kitchens, chapels, and command halls. When Richard the Lionheart went on crusade, his engineers designed collapsible siege towers and wooden fortifications that could be dismantled and moved by ship. These were brutal but sophisticated constructions, the martial cousins of the merchant's portable booth. The Mongols, too, whose empire stretched across continents, lived entirely in mobility. Their felt yurts were masterpieces of design, strong, warm, and easy to disassemble. Each family carried their world on carts, rebuilding it each time the herds moved. When European travelers saw the vast encampments of the Mongol Khans, they called them moving cities. To a medieval mind used to stone and mortar, it was a marvel beyond imagination. In this way, two traditions, the European timber frame and the Eurasian yurt, developed in parallel, both solving the same timeless problem: how to carry shelter through an unstable world. When these traditions met through trade, war, and diplomacy, they influenced one another quietly. The great encampments of the Ottoman sultans, for example, borrowed from both. Their royal tents were architectural wonders, some large enough to hold hundreds of people, supported by internal frameworks of wood and cord. The fabrics were richly embroidered, the interiors furnished with carpets and fountains. These were not mere shelters. They were mobile palaces, grander than many permanent buildings. A European ambassador visiting the Ottoman court in the 16th century wrote that the Sultan's encampment appeared as a city newly made, whose houses were of silk and whose walls breathed the scent of amber. It was an empire that could fold itself away and reappear wherever it wished, a vision of elegance and motion combined. Back in Europe, the legacy of portable construction spread downward again, from royalty to artisans. Traveling fairs, military engineers, and wandering builders all borrowed techniques from the royal court. By the Renaissance, carpenters had refined systems of panel housing, prefabricated wooden walls built in sections, designed to fit together like furniture. You could almost think of them as the IKEA of the 1500s, numbered, joinable, and surprisingly efficient. Such designs also made their way onto ships. Explorers setting out for distant colonies often carried with them flat-packed wooden buildings, chapels, forts, and homes, ready to be assembled upon arrival. The English at Jamestown, the Dutch in Batavia, the Portuguese in Goa, all brought bits of Europe with them, literally. In crates and bundles of wood, each plank carried the memory of this ancient practice to make a house that could travel. But the story was not only practical. There was poetry in it too, a sense that architecture could be both temporary and meaningful, that a home did not have to be eternal to matter. A merchant's booth, a royal pavilion, a sailor's fort, all of them expressed a quiet truth of medieval life, that permanence was an illusion. People moved, weather changed, kingdoms rose and fell. What endured was not the building, but the knowledge of how to build again. And as Europe approached the dawn of the modern era, that knowledge would soon serve an entirely new purpose. The world was about to grow vast, filled with ships, colonies, and trade routes. The portable house, once a humble structure for fairs and kings, was about to become a tool of empire. But before we follow it across oceans, it's worth pausing on one simple thought. Even in their grandest ambitions, these traveling palaces were still human things, built by hand, from wood, rope, and patience. They creaked in the wind, smelled of pitch and pine, and left faint impressions in the soil where they once stood. When the wagons rolled away, grass would grow over the marks, and the world would forget. But somewhere in a carpenter's workshop, new beams were already being carved for the next journey. By the dawn of the age of exploration, the world itself had become a kind of unfolding map. The restless urge to move, once confined to market roads and royal hunts, had turned seaward. Europe's harbors, crowded with tall-masted ships, were filled not only with men and goods, but with buildings waiting to be born. Crates of timber, bundles of nails, and labeled panels, the pieces of portable homes, were packed into holds alongside barrels of salted meat and gunpowder. They were not called modular houses, not yet, but that is what they were, flat-packed architecture, ready to be assembled wherever European boots touched land. When the English colonists set sail for Virginia in 1606, they brought with them prefabricated wooden structures built in sections back home. These were simple, sturdy frames of oak and pine, designed by military carpenters familiar with siege huts and campaign buildings. The voyage was long, the timber warped with salt air, but once ashore, these early settlers set about reassembling their portable town on the muddy banks of the James River in just a few weeks. A scattering of crates became Jamestown, one of the first European settlements in North America. It was not grand. It leaned and creaked, its roofs thatched with reeds, its beams sunk into damp earth. But it was, in a quiet way, a continuation of that same medieval tradition, a house built to move, to unfold in a new world, even as it stood still. It carried the memory of motion. Meanwhile, on the far side of the world, other nations were doing the same. The Dutch East India Company sent ships eastward, carrying not just goods but flat-packed outposts, prefabricated warehouses, customs offices, and homes for their officials. The Portuguese, in their voyages to Goa and Brazil, carried prefabricated chapels, timber structures that could be erected quickly to consecrate a new colony. These portable churches were often small, simple halls with removable walls and collapsible altars. They were built in Lisbon or Porto, taken apart and reassembled thousands of miles away, their sanctity surviving the voyage. It was a strange inversion of permanence. Faith, empire, and architecture, all carried on the wind and waves, for sailors and settlers alike. Mobility became survival. The portable house meant safety from strange climates, storms, and the unknown. On distant shores where stone was scarce or the soil too soft, wooden walls built from home offered both shelter and familiarity. As time passed, these structures became more complex. In the 17th, naval engineers designed modular fortifications, wooden bastions, and gun platforms that could be assembled quickly in hostile territories. The British Army built entire barracks this way. The panels, shipped flat, numbered, and slotted together like enormous puzzles. It was logistics turned into architecture. And once again, at the edges of empires, a small revolution took shape. Engineers realized that if you could build a fort this way quickly, efficiently, anywhere you could build a city the same way, the portable home. Once the tool of wandering merchants had become a technology of colonization. But there was another side to the story, quieter, slower, human. The same ships that carried soldiers and timber also carried families, artisans, cooks, and children. In their cramped cabins, people remade small versions of the homes they had left behind. They used fragments of sailcloth for curtains, scrap wood for shelves, and candlelight for warmth. When they reached land, these settlers often rebuilt their first dwellings from the pieces of their own ships. Whole planks became walls, masts became beams. The world's earliest colonial towns were, quite literally, built from the vessels that brought them there. Every colony began as a temporary camp, a portable settlement, much like those medieval fairs and royal caravans centuries before. The shapes were the same: wooden frames, rope fastenings, modular panels. Only the scenery had changed. As centuries passed, the technique of portable construction never disappeared. It adapted. During the Industrial Revolution, it evolved once more, this time not for kings or explorers, but for workers. In the 1850s, the English engineer Henry Manning designed what he called the portable colonial cottage, made from interlocking wooden panels. It could be built by unskilled hands in just a few days. Thousands were shipped to Australia and New Zealand for settlers seeking homes in the Gold Rush. Each cottage arrived in crates, labeled and ready to assemble. The instructions were brief: no part can be put together wrong. For many, this was their first home, both foreign and familiar. The spirit of medieval carpenters reborn in the age of steam. Elsewhere, portable buildings found new purposes. The British Army used them for field hospitals during the Crimean War. Explorers carried them to the Arctic, small timber huts that could withstand snow and wind. One such hut, built by the Antarctic expedition of Ernest Shackleton in 1908, still stands today on Ross Island, preserved by cold and silence. Inside lie wooden bunks, a stove, and crates of biscuits, a relic of that long lineage of homes built to move. And from those frozen panels, a line can be traced all the way back to a fairground in medieval England, where some unknown craftsman once hammered together a booth of numbered planks. When you look at a modern shipping container house, or a prefabricated cabin craned into place in a city today, you are seeing the same ancient impulse, the dream of a home that can follow you wherever you go. The materials have changed: steel instead of oak, glass instead of canvas, but the rhythm is the same: build, dismantle, move, build. Again, the portable house has always been a quiet companion to human wandering, part shelter, part symbol, part memory. And though today's world is full of fixed addresses and postcodes, we still feel that tug, the curiosity to see what's beyond the horizon, and the comfort of taking something of home with us. Perhaps that's why these stories calm us, because they remind us that movement and belonging are not opposites. For as long as people have walked the earth, we have carried roofs over our heads in one way or another: tents, carts, planks, or panels. Everywhere we go, we make a small, temporary promise to the land: let us rest here for a while. And when we leave, the marks fade, the grass returns, and history moves quietly on, rolling, folding, drifting, like the very homes that built it. If you listen closely to the whisper of fabric, the slow sigh of silk unfolding from a merchant's trunk, you can almost hear the sound of centuries moving. The silk we remember today, shimmering and royal, once began as something humble, a fiber spun in quiet villages, by hands that would never see the faraway cities their threads adorned. It is easy to think of the Silk Road as a grand, singular path, a line stretching from the palaces of China to the markets of Venice. But in truth, it was not a road at all. It was a network, thousands of tiny threads spun, twisted, knotted, and frayed by ordinary people who lived and worked along its many routes. Each trader, each weaver, each mule driver and potter made their small contribution to something vast. And yet, most of their names have been lost. Only the silk remains, the quietest witness to their labor. It begins, as so many histories do, with women and worms. Long before silk became the currency of emperors, it was a domestic craft. In small Chinese villages during the Zhou dynasty, perhaps as early as the 11th century BCE, women raised silkworms in bamboo trays, feeding them mulberry leaves day and night. The worms worked silently, spinning cocoons around themselves, pale, tight spirals that glowed faintly in lamplight. When the time came, the cocoons were boiled, the silk filaments drawn out carefully with sticks, twisted together into long strands. The first spinners didn't know that each cocoon held nearly a mile of thread. They only knew that the material shimmered like water and moved like breath. The sound of the reels turning, the creak of the loom, these were the small rhythms of an empire being born. In time, silk became not just a fabric, but a kind of quiet power. By the 2nd century BCE, during the Han dynasty, the Chinese court realized that silk was more than a luxury. It was a weapon of diplomacy, light, valuable, and desired by everyone who touched it. So the court began to send envoys west through deserts and mountain passes to exchange bolts of silk for horses, jade, and glass. These journeys were long and perilous, stretching across the Gobi Desert, through the shadow of the Pamir Mountains, and down into the valleys of Central Asia. But for most people, the Silk Road was not a grand adventure. It was routine, ordinary, the kind of boredom that keeps the world turning. Picture it, a caravan moving slowly across the Taklamakan Desert. The sun is heavy, the sand whispering like paper underfoot. The men walk beside their camels, faces wrapped in cloth against the wind. At night, when the air cools, they sit around low fires, sipping tea made from compressed leaves traded in Kashgar or Samarkand. One man repairs a broken strap. Another counts coins, tapping each one against his teeth. The goods they carry, silk, spices, and carved wood, are packed in woven baskets, labeled in charcoal, Luoyang to Merv. They do not speak of empires. They speak of weather, food, and prices. In their boredom lies the true shape of the Silk Road, a long chain of small labors, stretched over centuries. Even far from China, the echoes of silk-shaped daily life. In Bactria, women dyed imported silk with indigo and saffron, their fingers stained gold and blue. In Persia, artisans learned to weave silk with wool, creating new patterns of texture. In Byzantium, monks smuggled silkworm eggs, hidden in hollowed-out canes, defying imperial bans. Everywhere the thread went, it changed something, a technique, a taste, a trade route, and yet the thread itself never spoke. It only passed through hands, from loom to market, from market to court. If you stood in the bazaar of Merv or Aleppo in the 8th century, you might have seen the results, rolls of silk laid out in the morning sun, merchants sitting cross-legged beside them, their voices soft and rhythmic as they haggled. The silk rustled faintly in the wind like leaves. It was a sound the whole world came to recognize. For the people who lived along the Silk Road, silk wasn't luxury, it was labor. A weaver in Turfan might spend 10 days on a single shawl. A dyer in Bukhara might wake before dawn to stir a pot of indigo over a smoky fire. A camel driver might walk for 3 months, guiding his beasts over mountain passes, just to earn a handful of copper coins, and yet, in their slow, steady work, they built a system that stretched across continents, not through conquest, but through trade. Each spool of thread, each jar of dye, each bale of cloth, all of it added up to something immense. It was, in a sense, the first true global network, not of ideas or armies, but of hands. But for all its expanse, the Silk Road remained fragile. Sandstorms could bury a route for months. A single war could close a city. Famine could empty an entire stretch of trade posts. Caravans would detour through mountain paths or wait out the seasons, building small way stations from packed earth and wood. In these outposts, life settled into its own pattern. A few merchants, a tea-house, perhaps a small shrine, a quiet courtyard where silk was unrolled and measured under the light of a single oil lamp. The people who lived there did not see themselves as part of history. They were simply trying to survive, one thread at a time. If you close your eyes, you might imagine that place. A small clay house on the edge of the desert, a loom creaking in the corner, the smell of tea and of sun-dried fabric. Outside, the wind shifts, carrying, perhaps, the faint sound of a camel bell. The world turns, and the threads continue to cross east to west, west to east in quiet defiance of the chaos of empires. And yet, as the Silk Road wove its web across continents, one question lingered in the air. Unspoken but ever present, did the silk shape the world, or did the world shape the silk? A question of texture and of time, one will follow into the next section. The Silk Road, as it unfolded across the continents, was not only a trade route, it was a living geography of exchange, a quiet network of families, villages, and guilds that turned thread into survival. Empires rose and fell along its spine, but the small people, the weavers, dyers, and camelmen, carried on, their hands shaping the same patterns over generations. If you walked the road from Chang'an to Constantinople, you would pass through dozens of these invisible kingdoms, small, dusty outposts whose entire economies revolved around the making, moving, and mending of silk. The city of loops and knots. One of these kingdoms was Khotan, a green oasis town along the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, surrounded by sand on every side. Khotan thrived because of two things: its rivers and its silk. Legend said that Khotan silk came from a secret stolen long ago. A Chinese princess, forced to marry a foreign prince, smuggled silkworm eggs out of China, hidden in her elaborate hairpiece. She also brought mulberry seeds, wrapped in her veil. From these humble beginnings grew a new branch of the silk tradition, one adapted to desert air and riverbank farms. The women of Khotan learned to spin, weave, and dye. By the 5th century CE, their workshops were famous for cloth of extraordinary fineness, shimmering fabrics that seemed to hold the desert's sunlight. But what made Khotan silk unique was not its beauty, it was its method. Here, silk production was shared among families. One household might raise the worms, another might reel the threads, another would dye them with pomegranate or walnut husks, and finally, the weavers, often elderly women, would piece everything together on wooden looms that groaned softly under the weight of the fabric. Result was a community woven as tightly As the cloth itself, no one owned the process. Everyone contributed. The dyers of Samarkand farther west. In Samarkand, the work continued in a different rhythm. The city was one of the Silk Road's brightest jewels, full of blue-tiled mosques, fragrant spice markets, and water channels that gleamed like mirrors under the sun. Here, silk was dyed in deep, vibrant colors: crimson, indigo, saffron, and green. The dyers' workshops were small, smoky places tucked behind courtyards. Large copper vats bubbled all day, the air thick with steam and scent. Each color had its own recipe, a closely guarded secret passed down through families. To make red, they used dried cochineal beetles and madder root. For blue, crushed indigo leaves, fermented for weeks in clay jars. For yellow, saffron threads were soaked in oil and ash. The work was repetitive, exhausting, and dangerous. Dyers' hands were permanently stained. Their lungs burned from fumes. And yet, their colors gave life to every merchant's stall, from the Caspian to the Mediterranean. When travelers described Samarkand's markets, they always mentioned the silk first, the way it caught the light, the way it whispered when folded. Few thought of the men and women who had boiled, stirred, and strained those colors into being. Their labor was silent, but without it, the road itself would have faded. The guilds of Byzantium by the 6th century CE. Silk had reached Europe, and with it came secrecy and control. In the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Justinian established state-run silk workshops, guarded by imperial decree. The right to weave silk was a royal monopoly in the crowded quarters of Constantinople. Entire streets were devoted to the trade. There were guilds for reelers, guilds for dyers, guilds for embroiderers, each with its own hierarchy and strict rules. Apprentices spent years learning the precise tension of the threads, the correct knot for each border pattern. Silk was no longer just fabric. It was symbolic architecture, draped over altars, wrapped around saints' relics, woven into imperial robes. And yet, even here in the heart of empire, the human reality was the same as in Khotan or Samarkand: long hours, aching backs, eyes strained from lamplight. One Byzantine chronicler wrote, almost with admiration, that the silk workers labored like worms, making glory for others. It was not meant as poetry, but it might as well have been. The roads between these famous centers lay the real Silk Road, the smaller routes, where traders and weavers met in dusty inns and makeshift markets. In the valleys of the Pamirs, Tajik and Kyrgyz shepherds traded raw wool for silk thread. In Persia, nomads carried finished cloth on camelback to coastal ports. In northern India, merchants brought silk to Benares, where it was mixed with local cotton to create new hybrid fabrics. The world was never still. Goods moved. Languages mingled. Even styles of weaving traveled: the warp-faced brocade of China blending with Persian floral designs, creating textiles that no single culture could claim as their own. Each length of silk was, in a way, a map, its patterns showing where it had traveled and whose hands had touched it along the way. Silk and survival for the people who lived by silk. Survival depended on patience. A drought could destroy mulberry crops. A new tax could drive families into debt. A single missed caravan could leave warehouses full and stomachs empty, so they adapted. They learned to weave simpler patterns when dyes were scarce, to trade thread for grain, to reuse broken looms. Some workshops moved with the seasons, setting up in mountain villages during the summer, returning to city markets in winter. Others specialized in repair work, patching torn silk, cutting worn robes into smaller pieces to resell. Nothing was wasted. In that frugality lay the endurance of the Silk Road. It was not built on abundance, but on the ability to keep going when the world grew harsh, and through it all, the silk itself traveled, carried by winds and willpower, from loom to market, from merchant to monarch. It passed through countless lives, each one leaving a trace. Like fingerprints on polished fabric, by the time a single bolt of silk reached Venice or Damascus, it might have crossed 20 borders and changed hands 100 times. Every crease and fold in its surface was a record of movement, a testament to the world's quiet persistence. But change was coming. New powers would rise along the Silk Road. Caravans would grow larger, wealthier, more tightly controlled, and in that tightening, something would begin to unravel. The thread that once connected humble weavers to distant emperors would soon be stretched too far. And when it snapped, the world it held together, the world of small workshops, shared labor, and quiet survival, would begin to fade. But how exactly did this grand unweaving begin? And what replaced the soft empire of silk when it was gone? By the 14th century, the Silk Road, the vast network that had once stitched together East and West, was beginning to fray. For nearly 2,000 years, it had endured wars, plagues, and deserts. But nothing lasts forever. Not even a road made of stories. The end did not come all at once. It came gradually, like fabric thinning from use, a thread pulled loose here, another there, until the pattern that once held everything together began to fade. The fading of the caravans. The first blow came from the Mongol Empire, a force that, paradoxically, both destroyed and preserved the Silk Road. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, a vast swath of land, stretching from China to the Mediterranean, fell under a single rule. Roads were rebuilt, bandits were punished, and caravans could move freely. For a century, trade flourished like never before, but as the Mongol Empire fragmented, the road became dangerous again. New kingdoms rose and fell rapidly. Tolls increased. Routes closed. Travelers who had once crossed half the world now found it safer to stay home by the 1300s. Banditry and local wars made desert crossings perilous. The once bustling way stations, like Khotan, Merv, and Dunhuang, began to empty. Sand crept over their walls. Wells dried up. The old caravan bells grew silent. Yet even as the land routes faltered, something else was stirring beyond the horizon, the sea. Silk at sea merchants, always resourceful, began to follow the winds instead of the roads. They loaded their silks onto ships that sailed along the coastlines of India, through the Strait of Malacca, across to Arabia and East Africa by sea. Silk could move faster, cheaper, and with fewer middlemen. Port cities like Calicut, Hormuz, and Malacca, new patterns of trade emerged. Silk from China, spices from the Indies, glass from Venice, all meeting in the same crowded harbors. It was the dawn of the maritime Silk Road, a quieter successor to the overland route. But this new path favored the powerful, the shipbuilders, the navigators, the kings with fleets. The small weavers of Samarkand or the dyers of Khotan could no longer control their own destinies. The thread had been taken from their hands. The coming of plague and empire then. Came the Black Death, a shadow carried, perhaps, along those same trade routes. It followed the caravans and ships, spreading from east to west in waves of quiet devastation. Cities emptied, markets closed, trade faltered. For a time, even silk lost its luster. What good was beauty when the world itself seemed to be unraveling? But humanity endures, even after plague. When trade resumed, it did so under new masters. European empires, driven by the lure of silk and spice, began to map the oceans and claim the coasts. Portugal, Spain, and later England and Holland sought to control not just trade, but production, and with their rise came a new kind of silk, industrial, imperial, and impersonal. The looms of Lyon and Spitalfields by the 16th and 17th centuries. Silk was no longer the secret of the East. Silkworms had spread to Italy, France, and even England. The delicate craft that had once required desert rivers and mulberry groves now filled the air of cities with the rhythmic click of looms. In Lyon, silk weaving became an art of precision. Workshops lined the narrow streets, their windows wide to let in the light. Men and women worked side by side, weaving brocades for the French court. The sound was constant, the soft beat of the shuttle, the quiet hum of thread. In Spitalfields, a district of London, refugee weavers from France brought their skill and their silence. They lived in tall, narrow houses with large attic windows for their looms. If you walked there in the early morning, you would hear only the whisper of silk through wood, the same rhythm that had once echoed through Samarkand's markets and Khotan's courtyards. It was the same story, retold in a different key, silk born of patience and precision. Now woven in the shadow of machines, the age of industry, the 18th and 19th centuries brought the mechanization of weaving. Jacquard looms, early programmable machines, replaced the slow labor of hands with the rapid movement of punched cards and gears. Silk, once the most human of fabrics, became a symbol of industrial progress. Factories in Lyon, Manchester, and Milan produced ribbons, dresses, and upholstery by the mile. The ancient road of the caravans had become a system of steam and steel. Where once a merchant waited months for silk to cross the desert, now ships and trains could deliver it in weeks. The rhythm of history had accelerated, but something subtle was lost. The quiet dignity of the weaver, the patient work of the dyer, the community built around a single thread, all of it dissolved into the hum of industry. The ghosts of the road today. The old Silk Road still lingers. You can walk among the ruins of Dunhuang, where faded murals still show travelers and camels. You can stand in the empty bazaars of Merv, where the wind blows through cracked arches. In some villages of Central Asia, elderly women still weave silk by hand, their looms made from the same wood and stone their ancestors used 1,000 years ago. Each strand they pull carries memory of touch, of repetition, of quiet persistence. Their work is no longer about trade or empire. It is about continuity, a way of saying, we are still here. Threads that bind. If you trace the story of silk from the worms in bamboo trays, to the caravans crossing deserts, to the factories of lion, what you find is not just the history of a fabric, it is the story of connection itself. Every society that touched silk learned something from it: patience, craftsmanship, exchange. Every person who handled it left something behind: a method, a motif, a memory. Even now, when we speak of threads that connect us, in conversation, in data, in destiny, we are unknowingly speaking the language of silk, a metaphor that once was real. And so, the Silk Road never truly ended. It transformed from a path of camels and sand into a network of ideas and technologies. From dusty way stations into the glowing fiber-optic cables that now cross the world. The roads are different, but the dream is the same: to send something precious, a word, a story, a shimmer of meaning from one side of the world to another. In that sense, the silk still travels, and somewhere across the centuries, the weavers of Khotan and the dyers of Samarkand would understand perfectly. Perhaps that is the secret lesson of the Silk Road, that what binds us is not empire, nor gold, nor glory, but the patient, unseen labor of countless hands, working together to make something beautiful last. The sound of the quill was not dramatic. It was a faint, steady whisper, the soft scrape of a feather trimmed to a fine point, gliding across parchment as if tracing the edge of a dream. You can imagine it now. A small, dim room in Lisbon, perhaps, or Venice, or Antwerp, somewhere near the smell of salt and tar, where ships came in heavy with spices, stories, and rumor. The air smells of oil and old ink. A single candle burns beside a low table. The mapmaker bends close to his work. His eyes strain in the light. He moves slowly, deliberately. Each line he draws is a guess, a promise, a hope that the world might make sense on paper. You are with him, this quiet man of the 15th century, when maps were not yet certain things. They were prayers. The age is full of noise. Outside, the shouts of sailors unloading goods, the creak of rigging, the laughter of taverns. But in here, the world is silent, patient. The map grows not in haste but in stillness. He begins with the known, the coast of Portugal, the bulge of Africa. The ink spreads slowly into curves that resemble land, though he's never seen it. What he knows comes from others: sailors who exaggerate, merchants who forget, priests who imagine. A coastline might come from a rumor told 3 times, over 3 voyages, by men who could not write their own names. And yet, he listens. He listens because that is his craft. The cartographer is not a man of seas, but of whispers. In the late 15th century, the world was swelling with curiosity. The sea lanes that had once seemed endless and unbroken were now dotted with ports, islands, and imagined continents. The so-called age of exploration was as much an age of uncertainty as discovery. Every ship that sailed brought back not just cargo, but confusion. Maps, those flat, fragile sheets, became the place where the confusion could be made to look orderly. The Portuguese, meticulous and secretive, guarded their maps like treasure. In Lisbon's Casa da India, royal officials kept atlases under lock and key, for the map itself was worth more than gold. To know a coastline was to control it. To know the winds was to profit from them. And yet, no 2 maps agreed. One showed an island shaped like a horseshoe. Another showed it as a triangle. A captain swore there was a cape. Another insisted it was a bay. Even the stars seemed to move differently, depending on who looked to make a map. Then was not to draw truth, it was to negotiate it. The cartographer's hand trembles slightly as he sketches the western edge of Africa. He has heard sailors speak of a land beyond, a mysterious place where the sun sinks into a sea of mist. Some call it Chipangu, some call it nothing at all. He dips his quill again. He hesitates. Should he draw it? Should he leave it blank? He looks at the empty part of his parchment, the white waiting space where no ship has gone. It feels like looking at silence. He draws a faint line, barely visible, the outline of something that may not exist. In that gesture, he joins hundreds of other unknown mapmakers, each alone in their quiet rooms, sketching the uncertain edge of the world. Outside his window, the age moves on. It is the time of Prince Henry the Navigator, who never actually navigated, but sponsored men who did. It is the time of caravels, those small, daring ships with triangular sails that could slice through wind in ways medieval galleys never could. It is the time of brass astrolabes, of mariners' compasses, of sand-filled hourglasses ticking away each moment at sea. But for the cartographer, it is mostly the time of ink drying slowly on parchment. You can almost feel the rhythm of it. Draw, pause, breathe, draw again. The maps of the period look strange to modern eyes. They are covered with curls and vines, banners and beasts. Sea monsters swim along the edges, not as decoration, but as warning. Some serpents are drawn with gaping mouths, others with dragon wings. A man might set sail, see nothing but calm blue for weeks, and return swearing he'd seen the open jaws of Leviathan. And the cartographer, ever patient, would listen, nod, and make a small note in the margin. Here be dragons, he might write, not out of fear, but respect. Because every unknown space deserved its own name. There's something deeply human about that. The need to fill emptiness with meaning, the silence of the ocean, the blank of the parchment. Both demanded imagination. In this way, maps were less like mirrors and more like myths. The Ptolemaic worldview, inherited from the ancients, still shaped how men thought. Claudius Ptolemy's Geographia, copied and recopied for over 1,000 years, told scholars that the earth was surrounded by a great southern land, terra australis incognita. It had to exist, they thought, to balance the weight of the known continents. So, even when no sailor had seen it, the cartographers drew it. They filled the southern edge of their maps with winding, mountainous continents, full of imagined creatures and golden cities. To leave it blank would have been unacceptable. The human mind does not tolerate blankness well, and so, while explorers were risking their lives at sea, the men with ink-stained fingers and candlelit rooms were risking something quieter, but no less daring, the risk of being wrong. Imagine the cartographer finishing his map, wrapping it in oiled cloth, and sending it off to the royal court. He will never travel the world he draws. But when a ship leaves Lisbon or Seville, it carries his imagination folded in its chest. His lines will guide sailors into storms or around them. His shapes will lead merchants to profit or to ruin. His guesses will one day be corrected, but for now, they are the world itself. The candle flickers again. He looks at his map and sees not truth, but order. A fragile order made of ink and faith, the silence deepens. It is late now. The harbor outside has gone dark. The only sound is the distant crash of the tide against the shore, a sound that has not changed since the first man drew a line in the sand to show where the land ended on the cartographer's table. The parchment curls slightly as the ink dries. He sets down his quill and stretches his aching fingers. He leans back and studies the shape of the known world. Europe, Africa, a piece of Asia that looks more like memory than geography. Beyond that, the whiteness yawns, the ocean unmarked. He dips his quill once more and, in a delicate script, writes the words that have appeared on maps since the Middle Ages. Hixont dracones, here be dragons. Then he sits still for a long while, staring at that phrase. Perhaps he wonders what lies beyond. Perhaps he feels small or comforted. Or perhaps he simply enjoys the quiet sound of his candle burning down to nothing. Outside, the dawn will soon rise over the docks. Ships will unfurl their sails. Captains will curse and pray. And somewhere, far away, another mapmaker will be waking up, sharpening his quills, ready to copy this same map and change one detail or two. In that way, the world will keep expanding, not by discovery alone, but by repetition, by the slow, steady hand of men who turned gossip into geography. The whispering maps would travel across Europe, passed from scholar to sailor, from merchant to prince. Each new copy would blur a line, shift a name, add a creature, or erase one. Truth and imagination would mingle until no one could tell them apart. And yet, the maps worked. They guided voyages, even when wrong. They gave shape to the sea, even when false. Perhaps that is the quiet miracle of it, that belief itself can move ships. Across oceans, you picture the cartographer now, closing his shutters, extinguishing his candle, and leaving his little room. His map lies rolled on the table, drying in the half-light. Tomorrow it will be carried to a harbor office, then to a ship, then across the sea. Tomorrow it will become the world. But for now, the ink sleeps. It begins again with a line. Not a coastline this time, but a boundary. A line drawn not by a sailor, nor by a cartographer, but by men in fine robes, sitting in quiet chambers. Far from the sea, it is 1494. In the small Spanish town of Tordesillas, representatives of two great crowns, Portugal and Castile, meet in a dim hall to discuss the shape of the earth, not the roundness of it that had already been accepted, at least in theory, but how to divide it. They spread maps across the table, maps thick with guesswork, sketches of continents no one had seen. Somewhere on these parchments, they would draw a single line that would determine the fates of millions who had never heard of Tordesillas. The Treaty of Tordesillas was, in its way, a mapmaker's dream and nightmare at once. The Pope himself, Alexander VI, had issued a decree giving Spain all lands west of a certain meridian, an invisible line drawn from pole to pole, and Portugal everything east. The problem was simple, and yet impossibly vast. No one knew where those lands actually were, even longitude. The concept of measuring the earth east to west was not yet reliably calculated. There were no timepieces accurate enough to make such measurements. The cartographers had to imagine the world's width, like men guessing the length of a shadow. And yet the treaty was signed. A line was drawn. Half the world was divided by an ink stroke that could not possibly be accurate. In Lisbon, the royal cartographers received the news with a kind of quiet amusement. They unrolled their atlases, studied the globe as they knew it, and began to calculate what might fall within Portugal's portion. They could not have known that the line would pass, by chance, through the eastern edge of a land yet to be found, a land of forests and rivers stretching so wide that even centuries later its true borders would be unclear. They called it Brazil, and thus, with the stroke of a quill, the Portuguese Empire extended across an ocean they had not yet fully crossed. But such lines were fragile things. Every time a new ship returned with its logbook, a coastline would shift slightly. A cape once drawn straight became curved. A bay deepened or disappeared in the archives of the Casa da India. Scribes spent endless hours redrawing the same shapes, adjusting, perfecting, never finishing. The maps were never final because the world itself refused to stay still. It is a comforting kind of monotony, the repetition, the correction, the slow perfection of detail. Imagine those scribes bent over tables for years, their hands calloused from compass and quill. The smell of vellum, of sealing wax, of damp parchment fills the air. They worked in near silence, for the maps were state secrets. To steal one was treason. To copy one without permission could end a career or a life, and yet copies were made, always quietly at night in rented rooms near the docks. Anonymous mapmakers redrew Portuguese charts by candlelight, selling them to Venetian traders or French admirals. Sometimes the copies were deliberate fakes, with coastlines exaggerated to mislead rival fleets. Sometimes they were faithful replicas, passed hand to hand like contraband knowledge. Thus, geography became a form of espionage, and the whispers that filled the cartographer's world became a kind of currency. Elsewhere, in Antwerp, the beating heart of Europe's print revolution, the map took on a new life. Here, in the shops of engravers and printers, maps were no longer guarded in locked chests. They were published, sold, and displayed in the windows of booksellers. The world became public. A man named Gerardus Mercator, quiet and methodical, was one of these craftsmen. He was born in 1512, long after the first great voyages of Columbus and da Gama. Yet his maps would come to define how people imagined the earth for centuries. Mercator's genius was not in discovery, but in translation. He found a way to flatten the globe into something sailors could use, a map that allowed straight lines of navigation, even across curved seas. The Mercator projection, as it came to be known, was a mathematical compromise, a distortion that preserved direction but exaggerated size. In his maps, Europe loomed large, Greenland swelled, and Africa, vast and ancient, appeared smaller than it truly was. Perhaps the quietest bias of all, the world itself, reshaped by geometry and perspective, and yet the sailors loved it. For the first time, they could draw a straight line across the ocean and follow it with confidence. The whispering maps had learned to speak clearly. Still, the world beyond those lines remained elusive. For all the precision of Mercator's grids, the edges of his maps were still filled with mystery. The Northwest Passage, that mythical route to Asia through the frozen Arctic, was drawn again and again, each time slightly differently, each time just out of reach and in the southern hemisphere. Terra Australis Incognita, the great unknown land, remained, sprawling and silent. Some believed it to be a paradise, others a place of monsters. For centuries, mapmakers continued to draw it. Even as explorers failed to find it, they left it there because to remove it would make the world look incomplete. Maps, after all, were not just records of what was known. They were reflections of what was believed, in a way. These quiet craftsmen were historians of hope. Each line, each label, was a statement of faith, not only in geography but in humanity's ability to make sense of chaos. Think of the tools they used: the compass for drawing circles, the divider for measuring distance, the brass astrolabe for charting stars. Each tool required patience, precision, and imagination. When they wrote the names of lands, they did so in Latin, the universal tongue of learning. Mare Oceanum for the open sea, Sinus Magnus for a great gulf. Sometimes they added small notes in the margins. This land is full of elephants, or the natives are gentle and trade in gold. It did not matter if it was true. It mattered that it was recorded, for to record something, even wrongly, was to make it real, at least for a time. By the 17th century, maps had become not just navigational tools, but symbols of power. Kings and queens displayed them as proof of dominion. Merchants studied them like scripture. In London, Amsterdam, Seville, the walls of offices and academies were covered with maps, some enormous, some decorative, all claiming to show the same earth. But every map still whispered differently. The Dutch maps were crowded with ships, flags, and wind roses, boasting of commerce and trade. The Spanish ones, austere and symbolic, emphasized religious conquest, crosses over coastlines, angels hovering above. The English ones, methodical and plain, focused on ports and longitude. Each nation's maps told its own story, not just of land, but of purpose. And yet, amid all these grand designs, the quiet cartographer remained the same. The man alone, with his tools, his lamp, and his imagination. He was not a conqueror. He was a listener to sailors' tales, to royal commands, to the rhythm of the pen, perhaps. As he copied the outline of Africa for the 100th time, he wondered whether the earth would ever truly be known, whether every blank would one day be filled, or whether mystery was part of its shape, in a way. The world he drew was like a lullaby, a song of lines and silence, comforting in its repetition. Late at night, when the streets grew quiet and the presses cooled, the mapmaker might lift his eyes from the parchment and look toward the darkened horizon. He would not see the world as a sailor saw it, full of waves and danger. He would see it as a pattern, elegant, vast, and endlessly incomplete. The candlelight flickers again, catching on the curve of a brass compass. He takes a deep breath. There is one more coastline to correct, one more river to name. He dips his quill, steady and patient. The sound returns, that faint, soft whisper of ink against parchment. The sound of the world becoming visible and still. The question lingers, a question no cartographer could answer. Not then, and perhaps not even now, when you draw a map of the world. Are you revealing the truth of it, or merely creating a reflection of how you wish it to be? By the middle of the 18th century, the world was finally beginning to take shape. The blank spaces were shrinking. The seas that had once been drawn as smooth, silver emptiness, now filled with coastlines, rivers, and carefully measured latitudes. The whispers of the old cartographers, those men who drew from rumor and faith, were fading, replaced by the confident voice of science. The age of wonder was giving way to the age of accuracy. In the quiet of a workshop in Paris, a man named Guillaume Delisle leaned over his desk and sighed. The map before him was beautiful, precise, clean, and mathematical, but to him it lacked something. It lacked the old warmth of the unknown. Delisle was no mystic. He was a scientist, a mathematician. His maps were models of precision, correcting centuries of myth. He had measured longitudes by the moons of Jupiter. He had compared explorers' journals line by line. Yet, as he dipped his pen to trace the familiar shapes of Europe and Africa, he could not help feeling a strange kind of loss. For the first time in human history, the map no longer whispered. The age of exploration had always been about more than discovery. It had been about imagination, about believing that something vast and hidden waited beyond the next horizon. But now, by the time Delisle was working, the great voyages were largely done. The Portuguese and the Spanish empires were fading. The Dutch and English were busy trading, charting, building colonies, and everywhere maps became more certain. They were filled with grids, meridians, and precise scales. Gone were the sea monsters and angels. Gone were the playful shapes of fabled islands. In their place came measurements, numbers, coordinates. The world, once alive with myth, was now an object that could be measured, and therefore controlled. Still, there were places that resisted this order. The Pacific Ocean, vast and unknowable, remained an enormous question mark. Its scattered islands, Tonga, Tahiti, the Solomons, appeared on maps as faint dots, drawn from second-hand accounts in 1768. A new kind of explorer set sail, Captain James Cook, not in search of gold or spices, but of data. His ship, the Endeavour, was not just a vessel, but a floating observatory. On board were astronomers, botanists, and of course, cartographers. They carried sextants and chronometers, measuring instruments so precise that even the movement of the stars could be turned into numbers. For the first time, the world could be mapped with near-perfect accuracy. Cook's charts of the Pacific were so detailed that they would remain useful for over a century, and yet there was no poetry in them, no dragons, no whispered legends of phantom lands, only the calm precision of coastlines traced by logic and light. You might think this was progress, and it was, in its way, but something gentle was lost in that transition. For centuries, the cartographer's map had been both a document and a dream. Now it became a tool. The maps that once told stories now told truths. And truth, though powerful, is rarely soothing in Amsterdam. The great map publishers, Blaeu Hondius Vicher, began to fade from prominence. Their lavish wall maps, once displayed in the parlors of merchants and kings, were replaced by atlases printed in uniform type. The artistry drained away, replaced by standardization. A line was now just a line, not a gesture toward the unknown. The parchment gave way to paper. The candlelight gave way to daylight. The whisper became a hum of printing presses. Yet, if you look closely at one of those older maps, the kind drawn in the age before certainty, you'll see something remarkable. A subtle humanity woven into every uncertain curve, a tremor in the coastline where the mapmaker hesitated, a flourish in the lettering made when he was feeling inspired, a mountain drawn too tall because the story that described it was too vivid to ignore. Each imperfection was a fingerprint, a reminder that maps were once made by listening to sailors who spoke in awe, listening to winds, to silence, to rumor, listening to the world, even when it refused to explain itself. It's easy to forget how fragile those maps were. The ink could run if the air was damp. The vellum could crack. A single spark, a dropped candle, a careless sleeve could erase years of work, and yet thousands survived. They sit now in quiet archives, rolled and brittle. The ink faded to brown dot. If you were to hold one in your hands, say, a porcelain chart from the early 16th century, you would notice something almost living about it. The parchment, made from animal skin, still seems to breathe. The lines shimmer faintly in the light. The compass roses bloom across the surface like stars. The red and green root lines, radiating outward, feel like veins, the circulation of an old, patient world. It is a sleeping kind of beauty, delicate, peaceful, and utterly unhurried by the 19th century. Maps became instruments of empire. Lines were drawn not by explorers, but by surveyors. In India, Africa, and the Americas. The new rulers brought with them their instruments, theodolites, chains, and measuring rods, and began to carve the world into rectangles, rivers, mountains. And peoples were divided not by nature but by geometry. The quiet art of listening to the world had become the louder science of defining it. The whispering mapmaker, long forgotten, would have found it strange, even sad to see how their delicate work of imagination had turned into the hard edges of power. And yet, even here, there were still moments of wonder. When Charles Darwin sailed on the Beagle in the 1830s, he studied maps every day, not as mere guides, but as companions. He marked the edges of islands, compared coastlines, drew sketches of volcanic ridges. He treated the map not as finished truth, but as conversation, something alive, still becoming. Perhaps that is what the best maps always were, unfinished, today. When you open an atlas or zoom in on a satellite image, the precision is astonishing. You can see every coastline, every mountain ridge, every street. There are no dragons now, no here-be monsters. The world has been measured to the millimeter, catalogued, photographed, and digitized. And yet, sometimes, when you look at those old maps, with their faded ink and uncertain lines, you might feel something missing, a silence, a kind of soft, human hesitation that modern maps no longer know. Because long before the satellites and the screens, the world was drawn not by machines, but by patience, and patience has a voice. It sounds like the scratch of a quill on parchment late at night. It sounds like breath held steady as ink dries in the glow of a candle. It sounds like the whisper of the earth becoming knowable. Imagine. Now, one of those cartographers, perhaps the same quiet man we met before, growing older. His hair is gray now, his hands slower. He sits at the same desk he sat at for decades, surrounded by maps of a world he never saw, but helped create. He opens one last sheet of parchment. He does not copy the coastlines this time. Instead, he draws the wind, curving, spiraling lines, the kind that show the movement of the invisible. Because, perhaps, After all these years, he has realized that the truest maps do not show the land, but the motion that binds it all together. When he finishes, he leans back. The candle flickers low. The ink gleams. The world is still for just a moment. He smiles, faintly, quietly, and lets the candle go out. The room falls into darkness. Outside, the waves lap against the shore. And somewhere in another century, a new kind of map begins to form, not on parchment, but on screens, in code, in light. But even those modern lines, drawn by satellites orbiting far above, are connected to that same old whisper, the one that began in candlelit rooms, where men believed that to draw the world was to understand it. Perhaps that belief was naive, or perhaps it was the first, most beautiful way we ever tried to dream together. And so, as you imagine those whispering maps curling at the edges, the ink breathing quietly on old parchment, remember this: every map is a memory. Every coastline is a question once asked, and every line ever drawn began somewhere in silence. The ink has dried, the candle has burned low, and the monks who once traced the edges of the world have long since faded into the silence they cherished. Yet their work remains quiet circles of thought and faith, pressed between the pages of history. The world they drew was smaller than ours, but somehow it feels more human. Every sea a question, every mountain a hope, every unknown corner a prayer waiting to be answered. We may no longer map the heavens by candlelight, but the same desire endures to make sense of where we are, and what lies beyond the edges we can see. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine those quiet halls, again the rustle of robes, the steady scratch of ink, the slow unfolding of a world that was half faith, half imagination. The map ends, but the dreaming continues. Sleep well, traveler of quiet worlds. Until next time, this has been Boring History for Sleep. Good night.